The hearing room fell silent as Vivek Ramaswamy leaned into his microphone, a smirk playing across his face. He had just delivered what he thought was the perfect takedown of Representative Jasmine Crockett, calling her arguments amateur-hour politics from someone who clearly doesn't understand how the real world works. The 38-year-old entrepreneur and former presidential candidate was confident he had landed a devastating blow. But what happened in the next 60 seconds would wipe that smug expression clean off his face. Crockett's response was so sharp, so perfectly calculated, that even Ramaswamy's biggest supporters in the room couldn't help but wince. The moment would be replayed millions of times across social media, turning what Ramaswamy thought was his victory lap into a public humiliation that nobody saw coming. The tension in that government hearing room was about to explode, and the entire political world was watching. What started as Ramaswamy's attempt to embarrass a rising Democratic star ended up becoming a masterclass in political comebacks that left the biotech millionaire speechless and searching for an exit strategy. Before we dive into this incredible political showdown, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button so you never miss these explosive political moments that are reshaping American politics right before our eyes. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know the players and what brought them to this moment. Vivek Ramaswamy walked into that hearing room thinking he owned the place. At 38, the biotech entrepreneur had built a billion-dollar company, written best-selling books, and run for president. He was used to being the smartest person in the room, or at least thinking he was. Ramaswamy had made his reputation by taking on establishment politicians with his sharp tongue and business world confidence. He was known for his rapid-fire speaking style, his ability to cite statistics from memory, and his talent for making opponents look foolish with carefully crafted put-downs. In his mind, politics was just another business deal to be won through superior intellect and strategic positioning. But there was something about Ramaswamy that rubbed people the wrong way. His success had given him an air of superiority that came across as arrogance. He had a habit of talking down to people, especially those he perceived as less accomplished than himself. And he had a particular blind spot when it came to underestimating opponents who didn't fit his narrow definition of what a serious politician should look like. Representative Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, was everything Ramaswamy wasn't expecting. The 42-year-old Texas Democrat had risen through the ranks not through inherited wealth or business connections, but through sheer determination and genuine public service. A former civil rights attorney, she had spent years fighting for ordinary people who couldn't fight for themselves. Crockett had a reputation for being whip-smart and unafraid of confrontation. Unlike many politicians who tried to avoid conflict, she welcomed it. She had grown up in a working-class family and understood struggle in a way that someone like Ramaswamy never could. Her legal background had trained her to think quickly under pressure and to spot weaknesses in her opponent's arguments. But what made Crockett truly dangerous in a political fight was her authenticity. While Ramaswamy often came across as calculating and rehearsed, Crockett spoke from the heart. She didn't need talking points or carefully crafted sound bites because she genuinely believed in what she was fighting for. And when someone attacked her or her values, she didn't just defend herself. She went on the offensive. This wasn't just another routine congressional hearing. The topic was economic policy and government spending. Issues that both Ramaswamy and Crockett felt passionate about, but from completely opposite perspectives. Ramaswamy was there as a witness, invited by Republicans to argue for massive cuts to social programs and government regulations that he claimed were holding back American prosperity. The timing couldn't have been more significant. The nation was grappling with rising inflation, stagnant wages, and growing inequality. Working families across America were struggling to make ends meet, while corporate profits soared to record highs. This hearing represented a fundamental clash of worldviews about how to address these challenges. Ramaswamy represented the business community's perspective, that government intervention was the problem, not the solution. He believed that cutting taxes, reducing regulations, and shrinking social programs would unleash economic growth that would eventually benefit everyone. It was classic trickle-down economics wrapped in the language of innovation and entrepreneurship. Crockett, as a member of the committee, was there to challenge those arguments and defend the programs that millions of Americans depended on. For her, this wasn't just policy debate, it was personal. She had seen firsthand how government programs had helped people in her district survive and thrive. She had watched families kept afloat by food assistance, children educated through public programs, and seniors able to afford medication through government health care initiatives. The hearing room itself told a story. In the gallery sat a mix of lobbyists, advocacy groups, and ordinary citizens who had taken time off work to witness this debate about their economic future. Some wore expensive suits and carried briefcases full of position papers. Others wore their work uniforms and carried handwritten notes about how policy changes would affect their daily lives. The hearing was being broadcast live, with political reporters from major news organizations watching every exchange. Social media managers were standing by to clip and distribute key moments within minutes of them happening. Both sides knew that sound bites from this hearing would be replayed endlessly on cable news and social media. A strong performance could boost someone's national profile, while a bad showing could damage their credibility for months. The pressure was particularly intense for both main participants. For Ramaswamy, this was about more than just policy advocacy. It was about positioning himself as the future of conservative economic thinking. He had been making the rounds on political talk shows, building relationships with major donors, and establishing himself as someone who could bridge the gap between the business world and political activism. Ramaswamy saw this as his chance to establish himself as the intellectual heavyweight of the conservative movement. He had prepared extensively, armed with statistics, policy papers, and what he thought were unbeatable arguments. His team had conducted practice sessions where staffers played the role of hostile questioners. He had memorized economic data going back decades and prepared responses to every conceivable line of attack. He was confident that he could outmaneuver any Democrat on the committee, especially someone like Crockett, who he viewed as just another liberal politician spouting typical talking points. His research team had briefed him on each committee member's voting record and public statements, but their analysis was purely political and tactical. They had focused on policy positions and potential vulnerabilities, not on the personal experiences that shaped those positions. For Crockett, the stakes were equally high, but fundamentally different. This wasn't about personal advancement or building a national profile. It was about defending the people she had sworn to serve. Every policy Ramaswamy wanted to cut represented real families in her district who would lose crucial support. Every program he dismissed as government waste was a lifeline for people struggling to survive in an increasingly expensive economy. But Ramaswamy had made a critical error. He had done his research on policy positions and voting records, but he hadn't bothered to really study who Jasmine Crockett was as a person and as a political fighter. His team had treated her like just another politician to be outmaneuvered with superior preparation and rhetorical skill. They had completely missed the fact that she was someone who had earned her position through years of fighting, battles against opponents who underestimated her. He was about to learn that underestimating your opponent is the fastest way to end up flat on your back. And in a hearing room filled with cameras and reporters, that kind of mistake doesn't just hurt your pride, it can end your political aspirations. Before they really begin, the hearing had been proceeding routinely for about an hour when Vivek Ramaswamy was called to present his testimony. He approached the witness table with the confidence of someone who had given hundreds of presentations to corporate boards and investor meetings. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his hair immaculately styled, and his expression projected the kind of smug assurance that came from years of being told he was brilliant. Ramaswamy's opening statement was polished and aggressive. He rattled off statistics about government waste, cited economic theories, and painted a picture of an America being held back by bureaucratic incompetence and liberal policies. His delivery was smooth and practiced, the kind of performance that impressed business audiences and conservative donors. The fundamental problem with our current approach, Ramaswamy declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to, is that we have politicians making economic decisions who have never created a job, never built a business, never had to make payroll. They live in a fantasy world where money grows on trees and economic consequences don't exist. Several Republican committee members nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of message they wanted to hear, delivered by exactly the kind of messenger they wanted to promote. Ramaswamy was young, successful, articulate, and unafraid to take the fight directly to Democrats. But then came the question and answer period, and that's where things started to go sideways for the confident entrepreneur. Representative Crockett's turn came about 20 minutes into the questioning. She had been sitting quietly, taking notes, studying Ramaswamy's body language, and listening carefully to his responses to other committee members. Unlike some politicians who grandstanded for the cameras, Crockett was actually paying attention. "Looking for openings, Mr. Ramaswamy," she began, her voice calm and professional. "You've made some pretty sweeping statements about government programs and the people who support them. I'm curious about your perspective on economic mobility and opportunity." Ramaswamy straightened in his chair, sensing an opportunity to deliver another polished response. "Representative Crockett, I'm glad you asked. The data is crystal clear on this. Government dependency programs actually trap people in poverty rather than helping them escape it. What people need is opportunity, not handouts." "Interesting perspective," Crockett replied, her tone still neutral but her eyes sharpening. "And this conclusion is based on your extensive experience working with low-income families and communities?" The question hung in the air for a moment. It wasn't aggressive, but there was something about the way Crockett had phrased it that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. Ramaswamy, however, missed the warning sign completely. "Representative, I base my conclusions on data and economic analysis, not feel-good anecdotes," he said, his tone becoming more condescending. "I understand that's a different approach than what you might be used to, but in the business world, we deal in facts, not emotions." The room got a little quieter. Even some of the Republican committee members looked uncomfortable with Ramaswamy's tone. But he was just getting started. "You know," Ramaswamy continued, warming to his theme, "this is exactly the problem with our political discourse. We have people making policy decisions based on their feelings rather than evidence. It's amateur-hour politics from people who clearly don't understand how the real world works." There it was. The moment that would define the entire hearing. Ramaswamy had just dismissed a sitting member of Congress, a former civil rights attorney, as an amateur who didn't understand the real world. The smirk on his face suggested he thought he had just delivered a knockout punch. The Republican committee members looked pleased. Conservative staffers in the back of the room were already planning how to clip this exchange for social media. Ramaswamy leaned back in his chair slightly, the picture of satisfied confidence. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. In fact, she was just getting started. The moment that followed would become legendary in political circles. Crockett paused for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the weight of Ramaswamy's insult to settle in the room, long enough for cameras to capture the shift in her expression, long enough for everyone watching to understand that something significant was about to happen. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a different quality than it had moments before. Gone was the professional courtesy that had characterized her earlier questions. In its place was something sharper, more personal, more dangerous. "Mr. Ramaswamy," she said, her voice still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "I appreciate your lecture about the real world. It's fascinating to hear about economic reality from someone whose biggest hardship was probably deciding which private school to attend." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in the middle of a duel. Several people in the gallery actually gasped audibly. The Republican committee members, who had been nodding along with Ramaswamy's earlier statements, suddenly looked uncomfortable. Even the usually stoic security guards seemed to perk up, sensing that the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Ramaswamy's carefully constructed facade cracked for just a moment. His eyes widened slightly, his mouth opened as if to respond immediately, then closed again, as his brain apparently caught up with what had just happened. The smirk that had been his constant companion throughout the hearing faltered, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. But he was a successful businessman, someone who had negotiated million-dollar deals and faced down hostile corporate boards. He wasn't going to be derailed by one comment from a congressional representative, no matter how pointed it had been. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his tie slightly, and prepared to regain control of the narrative. the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Campaign staffers who had been casually taking notes suddenly looked up from their phones, sensing that they might need to pay closer attention to what was happening. Reporters in the back of the room began typing more urgently, recognizing that this exchange was moving beyond routine, political theater into something more volatile and potentially newsworthy. What none of them realized yet was that Ramaswamy's response in the next few seconds would determine whether this moment became a minor footnote in congressional hearing history or a defining moment that would follow both participants for the rest of their careers. The choice was entirely his. He could acknowledge the point, show some humility, and try to steer the conversation back to policy substance. Or he could double down on his dismissive attitude and find out exactly how much fight Jasmine Crockett was prepared to bring to this battle. Unfortunately for him, his ego made the choice before his political instincts could intervene. Ramaswamy's smirk slowly returned, broader now, as if he thought Crockett's personal comment proved his point about emotional rather than factual discourse. "Representative, I think you're deflecting from the substance of the argument," he said, trying to regain control of the exchange. "My background is irrelevant to the data." "Oh, your background is absolutely relevant," Crockett shot back, her professional demeanor giving way to something much sharper. "Because you just lectured me about not understanding the real world. And I think the people watching deserve to know exactly what kind of real-world experience you're drawing from." Ramaswamy was starting to realize he might have made a mistake, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. Instead, he doubled down. "Representative Crockett, with all due respect, creating businesses and jobs gives me a perspective on economic policy that career politicians simply don't have. I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable, but it's the truth. The condescending tone, the dismissive attitude, the casual arrogance, it was all there. And Jasmine Crockett was about to make him pay for every bit of it. With all due respect?" Crockett repeated, her eyebrows rising. "Mr. Ramaswamy, you just called me an amateur who doesn't understand the real world. You dismissed my questions as emotional rather than factual. And now you want to talk about respect?" The room was completely silent now. Even the usually chattering staffers had stopped whispering. Everyone could sense that something big was about to happen. "You know what?" Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. "Let's talk about the real world. Let's talk about understanding how policies actually affect people's lives. Because I think there might be some gaps in your education that need addressing." Ramaswamy's face was starting to flush. This wasn't going according to his script. He was used to debates where he could rely on statistics and talking points to overwhelm opponents. But Crockett wasn't playing that game. She was making this personal, and he wasn't prepared for that kind of fight. "Representative," he said, trying to regain his composure. "I'm happy to discuss policy substance, but personal attacks aren't really productive." The irony of Vivek Ramaswamy complaining about personal attacks after spending 10 minutes insulting Jasmine Crockett wasn't lost on anyone in the room. But Crockett wasn't done yet. In fact, she was about to deliver a response that would be talked about for months. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward in her chair, her eyes locked on Vivek Ramaswamy with laser-like intensity. The smug confidence that had carried him through the first part of the hearing was evaporating in real time, replaced by the dawning realization that he had severely underestimated his opponent. "Personal attacks?" Crockett repeated, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and controlled anger. "Mr. Ramaswamy, you just spent 10 minutes telling this committee and the American people that I'm an amateur who doesn't understand the real world. You dismissed my questions as emotional. You suggested that I make policy based on feelings rather than facts. And now you want to cry about personal attacks." The room was electric with tension. Republican committee members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while Democrats were leaning forward, sensing that their colleague was about to deliver something special. "Let me tell you about the real world, Mr. Ramaswamy," Crockett continued, her voice gaining power with each word. "The real world is a single mother working 2 jobs who still can't afford her child's medication. The real world is a veteran coming home from combat only to find himself sleeping under a bridge because he can't get the mental health services he needs. The real world is a family choosing between paying rent and buying groceries because wages haven't kept up with the cost of living." Ramaswamy tried to interrupt, But Crockett wasn't having it. "No, sir. You wanted to talk about the real world. So we're going to talk about it," she said firmly. "The real world is what I see every single day in my district. It's what I lived through growing up in a working-class family where we had to make choices that someone like you has never had to make. The contrast between the two of them couldn't have been starker." Ramaswamy, in his expensive suit and perfect hair, looking increasingly uncomfortable as his privileged background was dissected in front of a national audience. And Crockett, speaking with the passion of someone who had actually lived the struggles she was describing. "You want to lecture me about economic data?" Crockett pressed on. "Let's talk about data. The data shows that government programs you want to cut have lifted millions of people out of poverty. The data shows that food assistance programs reduce child malnutrition. The data shows that Medicaid expansion saves lives. But I guess that's just emotional thinking from someone who doesn't understand the real world." Ramaswamy's face was getting redder by the minute. He kept trying to find an opening to respond, but Crockett was relentless. "And since you brought up my qualifications," she continued, "let me remind you of something. Before I came to Congress, I spent years as a civil rights attorney, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. I've been in courtrooms arguing cases that determined whether families would have homes to live in. I've negotiated with corporations trying to deny workers their rightful benefits. I've stood up to powerful interests who tried to silence the voices of ordinary Americans. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. 20 minutes earlier, Ramaswamy had been the confident expert lecturing the politicians. Now he looked like a student being dressed down by a teacher who had caught him cheating on a test. "But you're right about one thing, Mr. Ramaswamy," Crockett said, her tone becoming even more pointed. "There is a difference between us. I've actually worked for a living. I've represented real people with real problems. I've had to fight for everything I've achieved. You inherited wealth and connections and turned them into more wealth and connections. Congratulations on winning the genetic lottery." Gasps could be heard throughout the room. Even hardened political reporters were looking at each other with raised eyebrows. This wasn't just a policy disagreement anymore. This was a complete dismantling of Ramaswamy's entire persona. "Representative Crockett," Ramaswamy finally managed to say, his voice noticeably shakier than it had been, "I think you're making this unnecessarily personal." "Personal?" Crockett shot back immediately. "You made it personal when you called me an amateur. You made it personal when you dismissed my life experience. You made it personal when you suggested that I don't understand the real world. I'm just returning the favor." The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. Camera operators were zooming in for close-ups, knowing they were capturing a moment that would be replayed endlessly. Social media was already exploding with clips of the exchange. But Crockett wasn't done yet. She had one more devastating blow to deliver. "And you know what the most insulting part of all this is, Mr. Ramaswamy?" she said, her voice dropping to a quieter but more intense tone. "You come in here with your talking points about government dependency and personal responsibility. But let me ask you something. How many government contracts has your company received? How many tax breaks have you benefited from? How much of your success was built on the same government infrastructure you want to tear down for everyone else?" Ramaswamy's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. This was clearly a line of questioning he hadn't prepared for. "Because that's the real hypocrisy here," Crockett continued, pressing her advantage. "You made your fortune in biotech, an industry that exists because of government-funded research. You've benefited from government-funded education, government-maintained roads, government-protected patents, and government-regulated markets. But somehow, when other people need help, that's dependency." The silence in the room was deafening. Ramaswamy looked like he wanted to crawl under the witness table. His prepared talking points were useless against this kind of systematic deconstruction. "So here's some free advice, Mr. Ramaswamy," Crockett said, leaning back in her chair with a slight smile. "Before you come into a room full of people who have spent their careers actually serving the public and start lecturing us about the real world, maybe do your homework. Because dismissing people based on your assumptions about their background is a really good way to end up looking foolish on national television." The committee chair tried to restore order, but the damage was done. Ramaswamy sat there stunned, his face red, his confidence completely shattered. The man who had walked into the hearing room, thinking he was going to school some amateur, politicians had just been systematically destroyed by someone he had underestimated. Do you have any response to the representative's points, Mr. Ramaswamy? The chair asked, probably regretting that he had to. Ramaswamy cleared his throat, took a sip of water, and tried to salvage what was left of his dignity. I think we can have disagreements about policy without making it personal, he said weakly. The response fell flat. After spending 20 minutes making it personal himself, his attempt to take the high road rang hollow. Crockett just smiled. I couldn't agree more, Mr. Ramaswamy. I couldn't agree more. Within minutes of the hearing ending, the political world exploded. The exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Vivek Ramaswamy was already being shared thousands of times across social media platforms, with viewers struggling to find adequate words to describe what they had just witnessed. The clip started trending almost immediately. On Twitter, Crockett Destroys Ramaswamy was climbing the trending list faster than social media managers could track it. The hashtag #YourRealWorldCheck started gaining traction as users shared their own experiences with economic hardship, contrasting them with Ramaswamy's privileged background. Conservative commentators who had been prepared to celebrate Ramaswamy's appearance found themselves scrambling to do damage control. Liberal accounts, meanwhile, were having a field day. One viral tweet read, Jasmine Crockett just gave a masterclass in how to dismantle privilege disguised as expertise. This is what happens when someone who's actually lived in the real world meets someone who just thinks he understands it. The memes started flowing almost immediately. Screenshots of Ramaswamy's shocked face were paired with captions like when you mistake confidence for competence and the exact moment privilege met. Reality. Video compilations contrasting his arrogant opening statements with his defeated final responses were shared tens of thousands of times. What happened in the following days could only be described as a political earthquake that sent shockwaves through both parties and reshaped the conversation about economic policy and political discourse in America. The video clips weren't just going viral, they were becoming cultural touchstones. Late-night comedy shows dedicated entire segments to analyzing the exchange, with comedians praising Crockett's timing and delivery while mercilessly mocking Ramaswamy's overconfidence. Saturday night comedy sketches recreated the moment with actors, turning Ramaswamy's amateur hour comment into a running joke that would follow him for months. Political science professors at universities across the country began incorporating the exchange into their curricula as a case study in political communication. Students analyzed Crockett's strategic use of personal narrative, her ability to turn Ramaswamy's attacks against him, and her masterful control of the room's emotional temperature. The exchange became required viewing in courses on rhetoric, political strategy, and public administration. International media picked up the story as well, with foreign correspondents using it as an example of American political theater and the growing tensions between different economic philosophies in the United States. European newspapers ran analysis pieces about what the exchange revealed about American attitudes toward wealth, privilege, and authentic leadership. The fundraising numbers told their own story. Within 48 hours of the hearing, Crockett had received over 50,000 individual donations, most of them small amounts from working-class Americans who saw her as someone who truly understood their struggles. Her campaign war chest, which had been modest before the hearing, suddenly swelled to levels that put her on the radar of national political strategists, corporate. Lobbyists who had previously ignored the representative from Texas were suddenly taking meetings and trying to understand her policy positions. Business groups that had dismissed her as just another progressive voice were realizing they needed to take her seriously as someone who could influence national economic policy debates. The ripple effects extended far beyond the two main participants. Other Democratic politicians began reaching out to Crockett's team, wanting to understand her communication strategy and learn from her approach to handling hostile questioning. Republican strategists, meanwhile, began warning their clients about underestimating opponents and the importance of showing respect even when disagreeing on policy. Political donors on both sides took notice. Conservative mega-donors who had been considering investments in Ramaswamy's political future put their checkbooks away, at least temporarily. They had been attracted to his business success and articulate presentation style. But his performance in the hearing raised questions about his political instincts and ability to handle unexpected challenges. The moment also sparked broader conversations about authenticity in politics. Voters across the political spectrum seemed hungry for politicians who spoke from genuine experience rather than prepared talking points. Crockett's background as someone who had actually lived the economic struggles she discussed gave her a credibility that resonated with audiences. Tired of privileged politicians claiming to understand working-class concerns, social media influencers, and political commentators began using the exchange as a template for discussing the difference between theoretical knowledge and lived experience. The phrase, "let me tell you about the real world," became shorthand for challenging those who spoke about poverty and hardship without having experienced them. Personally, the moment even influenced political advertising strategies. Democratic consultants began crafting messages that emphasized their candidates' authentic backgrounds and real-world experience, while Republican strategists warned their clients about the dangers of appearing out of touch or dismissive of opponents' life experiences. Democratic leadership was thrilled. Party officials who had been looking for ways to elevate promising voices in their caucus suddenly found themselves with a star on their hands. Crockett's fundraising exploded overnight, with small donors across the country sending money to support someone who had stood up to privileged arrogance so effectively. Republican leadership, meanwhile, was less happy. They had invited Ramaswamy to testify specifically because they thought he would make Democrats look bad. Instead, he had become the face of out-of-touch elitism that Democrats could use against them for months. Some GOP strategists were already quietly suggesting that maybe they needed to be more careful about their choice of witnesses. Behind closed doors, Ramaswamy's political advisors were in crisis mode. The candidate who had built his brand on being smarter and more prepared than everyone else had just been intellectually dismantled on live television. Focus groups showed that even conservative voters found his performance off-putting and his dismissive attitude toward Crockett inappropriate. Ramaswamy's team tried multiple approaches to contain the damage. First, they attempted to frame the exchange as a policy disagreement that the media was sensationalizing. That approach failed when reporters kept playing back the audio of him calling Crockett an amateur who didn't understand the real world. Next, they tried to suggest that Crockett had been unfairly personal in her attacks. This strategy backfired spectacularly when social media users created side-by-side comparisons showing exactly who had initiated the personal commentary. Finally, Ramaswamy himself appeared on several friendly media outlets attempting to rehabilitate his image, but his explanations came across as defensive and tone-deaf. When one conservative host suggested that maybe Crockett had been too aggressive, Ramaswamy agreed, a response that was immediately clipped and shared as evidence that he still didn't understand what had gone wrong. The exchange became a case study in the dangers of political arrogance. Political science professors started using it in classes to illustrate how assumptions about opponents can lead to devastating tactical errors. The lesson was clear. Underestimate your political opponents at your own peril. For Crockett, the moment transformed her from a relatively unknown House member into a national political figure. Speaking invitations poured in from across the country. Democratic donors who had never heard of her before were asking how they could support her future campaigns. Political commentators were already speculating about her potential for higher office. The exchange also highlighted the growing divide in American politics between those who had lived economic struggle and those who had theorized about it. Crockett's background as someone who had actually experienced financial hardship and worked her way up through the system gave her a credibility that Ramaswamy's business success couldn't match when it came to discussing economic policy's human impact. In the weeks following the hearing, Ramaswamy's political stock plummeted. Donors who had been excited about supporting his future campaigns began having second thoughts. His speaking fees dropped, and several organizations quietly canceled upcoming appearances. More importantly, the exchange damaged his brand as someone who could effectively take on Democratic politicians. The entire appeal of Ramaswamy as a political figure had been his supposed ability to out-argue and intellectually overpower opponents. That image was now in ruins. Crockett, meanwhile, saw her influence within the Democratic caucus grow significantly. Colleagues who had viewed her as just another freshman representative began seeking her input on strategy and messaging. Her performance had shown that she could hold her own against any opponent, no matter how confident or well-credentialed they appeared to be. The Ramaswamy-Crockett exchange became a perfect example of why authentic experience trumps theoretical knowledge in political combat. Ramaswamy had come to the hearing armed with statistics and talking points, but he hadn't prepared for an opponent who could speak from genuine lived experience. The moment also demonstrated the importance of respecting your opponents in political discourse. Ramaswamy's dismissive attitude and condescending tone had given Crockett the opening she needed to turn the entire exchange against him. If he had approached the hearing with humility and respect, he might have avoided the disaster that followed. Months later, clips of the exchange were still being shared across social media. It had become the template for how to respond to condescending political opponents. The phrase, "Let me tell you about the real world," became a rallying cry for politicians who had actually lived the struggles they were discussing. Political operatives on both sides studied the exchange carefully. Democrats learned how to effectively challenge opponents who tried to dismiss their credentials based on assumptions about their backgrounds. Republicans learned the dangers of underestimating opponents and the importance of avoiding needlessly antagonistic rhetoric. The hearing had lasted only a few hours, but its impact would be felt for years to come. Vivek Ramaswamy had walked into that room thinking he was going to establish himself as a serious political force. Instead, he had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of privileged arrogance in American politics. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, had used those same few hours to announce herself as a force to be reckoned with on the national political stage. Her performance had been a masterclass in political communication, showing how preparation, authenticity, and strategic thinking could overcome even the most confident opponent. The story of what happened when Vivek Ramaswamy mocked Jasmine Crockett serves as a powerful reminder that in politics, as in life, respect and humility will take you much further than arrogance and assumptions. Ramaswamy learned this lesson the hard way, in front of a national audience that won't soon forget his fall from grace. For those watching at home, the exchange provided a satisfying example of justice served, a moment when someone who thought they were untouchable discovered that talent and determination can overcome privilege and connections every single time. Thanks for watching this incredible political showdown unfold. If you enjoyed seeing how Jasmine Crockett dismantled Vivek Ramaswamy's arrogance with facts and authentic experience, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We'll keep bringing you the most explosive political moments that mainstream media might miss. What did you think of Crockett's response? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see what happens when real-world experience meets privileged assumptions.